The moment Evangeline Hartwell stepped off the dusty stagecoach into Copper Creek, she didn't know that in 3 hours she'd be riding hard across the desert with a wanted man's arm locked around her waist and his Colt .45 pressed against her ribs. The July sun beat down mercilessly on the ramshackle frontier town, turning the air thick as molasses. Evangeline adjusted her traveling bonnet and smoothed her navy wool dress. Practical choices for a woman heading west to teach school, though every fiber clung uncomfortably to her skin. Around her, the town bustled with the controlled chaos of commerce. Ox-drawn wagons creaking under loads of silver ore, prospectors arguing over claims, and the distant ring of hammer on anvil from the blacksmith shop. She'd come here to escape the suffocating propriety of Boston, where her father's debts had finally caught up with the family name. Teaching in a frontier town wasn't glamorous, but it offered something her old life couldn't: the chance to matter, to build something real with her own two hands. Miss Hartwell, a weathered man in a sheriff's badge, approached, tipping his hat. Name's Sheriff Coleman. Got word you'd be arriving today. Sheriff. She offered a polite nod, noting how his eyes kept darting toward the saloon across the street. Even at midday, raucous laughter spilled from its batwing doors. Schoolhouse is just down the way, he said, gesturing vaguely. But I ought to warn you, we've had some trouble lately. Outlaw by the name of Jake Rourke's been hitting banks from here to Tucson. Man's got a reputation for being unpredictable. Evangeline had read about Jake Rourke in the newspapers back east. The stories painted him as either a cold-blooded killer or a gentleman bandit, depending on which paper you believed. What they all agreed on was his uncanny ability to vanish into the desert like smoke. I appreciate the warning, Sheriff, but I didn't come all this way to hide in my room. Coleman's mustache twitched. Figured you'd say something like that. Your predecessor, Miss Abernathy, she had the same fire in her belly. Of course, she also had the good sense to marry the banker and retire before things got too heated around here. The comment stung more than Evangeline cared to admit. At 26, she'd watched most of her childhood friends disappear into marriage and motherhood, while she'd spent her days caring for her ailing mother and keeping her father's creditors at bay. Now, finally free to choose her own path, she wasn't about to let fear dictate her decisions. Where might I find lodging for the night? Mrs. Patterson runs a respectable boarding house just past the church. Clean beds, decent food, and she don't abide drinking or carousing under her roof. As if summoned by their conversation, a plump woman in a faded calico dress bustled over. You must be our new schoolteacher. I'm Martha Patterson. Come along, dear. Let's get you settled before the afternoon heat becomes truly unbearable. The boarding house proved to be a haven of domestic order in the midst of frontier chaos. Evangeline's room was small but spotless, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street. She unpacked her few belongings, mostly books and the silver locket that had belonged to her mother, and tried to imagine making this place home. Around 5 o'clock, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Evangeline ventured out to explore the town. She wanted to see the schoolhouse, to begin planning her lessons, but also to understand the community she'd be serving. The evening air carried the scent of wood smoke and frying bacon, mixing with the ever-present dust that seemed to coat everything in this part of the world. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a simple wooden structure with a bell tower and windows that had seen better days. Inside, desks stood in neat rows, waiting for students who might never come if the stories about outlaw raids were true. Evangeline ran her fingers along the scarred wooden surface of the teacher's desk, imagining the lessons she'd teach, the young minds she'd nurtured. That's when she heard it, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast. Through the window, she watched a lone rider tear down the main street, bent low over his horse's neck. Even at a distance, she could see the desperation in his posture, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder. Behind him, a cloud of dust marked the approach of his pursuers. The rider pulled up short in front of the general store, and Evangeline got her first clear look at Jake Rourke. He wasn't what she'd expected. The newspapers had described a giant of a man, scarred and brutal, but the figure dismounting from the lathered horse was lean and quick, moving with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to danger. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and even from her hiding spot, she could see the intensity in his green eyes as he scanned the street. He wore the practical clothes of any cowhand, worn leather chaps, a dark shirt, and a hat that had seen better days. But there was something in his bearing that marked him as different. Dangerous, yes, but not in the crude way she'd imagined. This was a man who'd learned to survive by reading people, by staying one step ahead of trouble. The posse rounded the corner just as Rourke disappeared into the general store. 6 men, all armed, all looking like they'd been riding hard for hours. Their leader, a tall man with a deputy's badge, signaled for them to spread out and surround the building. Evangeline knew she should stay hidden, should wait for whatever was about to happen to play out without her involvement. But something about the scene troubled her. These weren't lawmen seeking justice. They moved with the predatory efficiency of bounty hunters more interested in collecting a reward than ensuring a fair trial. She was still debating what, if anything, she should do when Jake Rourke burst through the back door of the general store and spotted her through the schoolhouse window. Their eyes met across the dusty space between buildings, and in that instant, Evangeline understood that her carefully planned new life was about to take a turn she'd never imagined. Rourke moved toward the schoolhouse with purposeful strides, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. Behind him, shouts erupted as the posse realized their quarry had slipped the net. But as Jake Rourke's boots hit the schoolhouse steps, Evangeline had to wonder, was she about to become his salvation or his next victim? Jake Rourke kicked open the schoolhouse door just as the first gunshot splintered the wood frame beside his head. "Get down." He lunged toward Evangeline, who stood frozen by the window like a doe caught in lantern light. His arms swept around her waist, pulling her to the floor as another bullet shattered the glass above them. "What? Who are you?" she gasped, though she already knew. Up close, Jake Rourke was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30 at most, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the desperation etched into every line. "Someone who's about to get you killed if you don't listen." His voice carried a rough edge, but underneath she heard something unexpected, genuine concern for her safety. "Stay low." Through the broken window, Deputy Marshal Crenshaw's voice boomed across the street. "Give it up, Rourke. You're surrounded, and we've got all night." Jake's jaw tightened. He'd recognized that voice anywhere. Crenshaw had been hunting him for 3 months, ever since the botched bank job in Prescott. The job that had gone wrong because someone had tipped off the law. The job where Jake's partner, young Tommy Brennan, had taken a bullet in the back while they ran. "I need a horse," Jake said, his green eyes scanning the room for options. "And I need to get out of this town alive. Then let me go and find another way." Evangeline's voice was steadier than he'd expected. Most folks would be weeping or begging by now, but this woman met his gaze without flinching. "I'm nobody to you. I can't help you." "You're wrong about that." Jake moved to the side window, keeping his body between her and the street. "Right now, you're the only thing standing between me and a rope." The truth hit Evangeline like a physical blow. "You mean to take me hostage?" "I mean to stay alive." But even as he said it, something twisted in his chest. He'd never taken a hostage before, never involved innocent folks in his troubles. The Jake Rourke who'd started robbing banks 2 years ago had been a different man. Desperate, angry, but still bound by certain rules. This version of himself, the one pressed against a schoolhouse wall with a schoolteacher's life in his hands, felt like a stranger. "Listen to me," Evangeline said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I saw those men ride in. They're not here for justice. They're here for blood money. But if you take me, if you hurt me, you'll become the monster they say you are." Jake's hand stilled on his gun. "What do you know about what I am? I know you warned me to get down before you worried about yourself. I know you could have just shot me to keep me quiet, but you didn't." Evangeline shifted slightly, studying his profile. "And I know you're not the cold-blooded killer the papers make you out to be." For a moment, something flickered in Jake's expression, surprise, maybe, or recognition. But it vanished as quickly as it came. "Lady, you don't know a damn thing about me." "Then tell me." The word surprised them both. "What happened to make you choose this life?" Jake almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Here he was, trapped in a schoolhouse with a posse outside waiting to fill him full of lead, and this woman wanted to have a conversation about his life choices. "You really want to know?" He peered around the window frame, counting heads. 6 men, all with rifles trained on the building. No back exit that wouldn't put them in the open. "I was a fool who trusted the wrong people." That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. But even as he said it, Jake found himself remembering the failed ranch outside Tucson, the drought that killed his cattle, the banker who'd promised one thing and delivered another. The day he'd walked into the First National Bank of Prescott with a gun in his hand and desperation in his heart. A sound from the back of the building made them both freeze. Footsteps, trying to be quiet but failing on the creaky wooden floor. "They're coming in the back," Jake whispered. He grabbed Evangeline's hand and pulled her toward the front door. "Stay close to me, and when I say run, you run." "Where?" "The church. Bell Tower. If we can get up there, I can pick them off one by one until they decide the bounty ain't worth dying for." Evangeline's mind raced. The church was 50 yards away across open ground. Even if they made it, she'd be trapped with him, complicit in whatever violence followed. But the alternative, staying here while armed men closed in from both sides, seemed worse. "On three," Jake said, his hand steady on the door latch. "1, 2. The back door exploded inward as two bounty hunters rushed through. Jake spun, his Colt clearing leather with practiced speed. The first man went down with a bullet in his shoulder, the second dove for cover behind an overturned desk. Now, Jake yanked open the front door, and they burst into the fading daylight. Evangeline ran harder than she ever had in her life, her boots slipping in the dust as bullets whined past her ears. Jake stayed behind her, his gun blazing as he returned. Fire. She could hear him breathing hard, could smell the acrid scent of gunpowder and sweat. They reached the church just as Deputy Marshal Crenshaw rounded the corner, his rifle aimed at Jake's back. Without thinking, Evangeline threw herself sideways, crashing into Jake and sending them both tumbling through the church doors as Crenshaw's shot went wide. Inside, the church was cool and dim, afternoon light filtering through stained glass. Windows that cast rainbow patterns on the wooden pews. Jake rolled to his feet, his gun already swinging toward the door, but Evangeline caught his wrist. "Wait. Lady, they're going to—" "My name is Evangeline." She was breathing hard, her hair falling loose from its pins, but her eyes were steady. "And I just saved your life. The least you can do is tell me yours." Jake stared at her. In the colored light from the windows, she looked like something from a painting, all golden hair and determined blue eyes. He'd grabbed her as a means to an end, but somewhere in the space between the schoolhouse and the church, something had shifted. "Jake," he said finally. "Jake Rourke. I know who you are. What I don't know is why you're running from men who should be wearing badges but aren't." The question caught him off guard. "How do you?" "Because I was a lawyer's daughter before. I was a schoolteacher. I know the difference between lawmen and bounty hunters." Evangeline moved to the window, peering through the glass. "Those men out there aren't interested in bringing you in alive." Jake felt something inside him crack. For months, he'd been running alone, trusting no one, assuming everyone was either hunting him or working for those who were. To have someone, especially someone like her, see the difference between justice and vengeance. "The bank job in Prescott," he said quietly. "Someone tipped them off. My partner got killed, and I barely got out alive. Ever since then, it's been one step ahead of the grave." "Who betrayed you?" "If I knew that, I wouldn't be running." Jake moved to the opposite window, checking their position. "But I've got my suspicions." Outside, Crenshaw's voice carried across the dusty street. "Rourke, send the woman out, and maybe we'll make this quick." Evangeline felt ice in her veins. These men had no intention of taking Jake alive, and they didn't much care what happened to her in the process. "There's a ladder to the bell tower," she said suddenly. "Behind the altar." Jake looked at her sharply. "Why are you helping me?" It was a fair question, one she'd been asking herself since they'd run across the street together. The safe answer would be fear. She was helping him because she was afraid of what would happen if she didn't. But standing there in the church, where she'd planned to attend services, looking at a man who was clearly more than the sum of his crimes, Evangeline realized it wasn't fear driving her at all. "Because everyone deserves a chance at redemption," she said. "Even you." For a long moment, Jake just stared at her. Then he holstered his gun and extended his hand. "Come on, then. Let's see if you're right about that bell tower." As they climbed toward the wooden ladder, Evangeline couldn't shake the feeling that she was ascending toward more than just a tactical advantage. With each rung that brought them higher, she was leaving behind the safe, predictable life she'd planned for herself. But when Jake's hand closed over hers to help her through the trapdoor into the bell tower, she realized she wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. She was afraid of what she might be willing to do to keep him alive. The bell tower offered a commanding view of Copper Creek, but what Evangeline saw made her blood run cold. More riders were approaching from the east, at least a dozen men, all armed, all moving with the same predatory purpose as Crenshaw's group. "We're not getting out of here the way we came in," Jake said grimly, his eyes scanning the growing crowd. Below, he'd positioned himself at the window facing the street, his rifle steady despite the impossible odds. Then how? Evangeline moved to the opposite window, her heart hammering as she counted heads. "There must be 20 men down there now. There's a way." Jake's voice was quiet, but she heard something in it that made her turn. "But you're not going to like it." Before she could ask what he meant, a new voice cut through the evening air, one that made Jake's face go white as winter snow. Jacob Rourke. The voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is Marshal Wade Garrett. I'm offering you one chance to surrender peacefully." Evangeline watched Jake's knuckles whiten around his rifle stock. "You know him?" "Yeah." The word came out like a curse. "I know him." Marshal Garrett sat astride a black stallion in the middle of the street, his silver hair gleaming in the fading light. Unlike the rough bounty hunters surrounding him, Garrett looked every inch the lawman. Pressed uniform, polished badge, the kind of man who'd built his reputation on bringing order to chaos. "He's the one who betrayed you," Evangeline said. "It wasn't a question." Jake's laugh was bitter. "Worse than that. He's the one who made me." The story came out in fragments, punctuated by the sound of men positioning themselves around the church. Wade Garrett had been Jake's mentor, the marshal, who'd taken in a 16-year-old orphan and taught him everything about law and justice. For 5 years, Jake had ridden with Garrett's posse, learning to track outlaws, to read the land, to survive in the wilderness that claimed so many lives. "He was like a father to me," Jake said, his eyes never leaving the street below. "Taught me to shoot, to ride, to see the difference between right and wrong. Or so I thought. What happened? I found out he was taking money from the very outlaws we were hunting, letting them know when posses were coming, which routes to avoid, which banks had the lightest security." Jake's voice grew harder. "When I confronted him, he set me up, made it look like I was the one selling information." Evangeline felt pieces clicking together. "The bank job in Prescott was supposed to be easy. Garrett made sure I knew exactly when the shipment would arrive, exactly how many guards would be on duty. What he didn't tell me was that he'd already warned the bank president." Jake's finger found the trigger of his rifle. "Tommy Brennan died because I trusted the wrong man." Down on the street, Marshal Garrett dismounted with the careful precision of someone performing for an audience. "You've got 5 minutes to send out the woman and surrender, Jacob. After that, we're coming in. He's not going to take you alive." Evangeline said. "I know." Jake turned from the window to face her. "Which is why you need to get out of here. Now, I'm not leaving you." The word surprised them both. Evangeline had spent her whole life being careful, thinking through consequences, choosing the safe path. But looking at Jake, really looking at him, she saw something that called to a part of herself she'd never acknowledged. "Listen to me," Jake said urgently. "There's a rope in the corner, probably used for hoisting supplies. You can climb down the backside of the tower while they're focused on the front. Get to the livery stable, take a horse, and ride hard for Tucson. Don't stop until you reach the territorial capital. And leave you here to die. Better than both of us dying." Evangeline moved closer to him, close enough to see the gold flecks in his green eyes, close enough to smell the leather and desert sage that clung to his clothes. What if there was another way? There isn't. What if there was? She reached out, her fingers brushing his wrist. "Tell me about the land. You said Garrett taught you to read it. What's out there beyond the town?" Jake frowned, but he found himself answering. "Desert mostly. Rough country. But there are canyons where a man could lose himself if he knew the way. Springs hidden in the rocks. Game trails that don't show on any map. Could you find your way to Mexico? Maybe. If I had water and supplies and a good horse." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Instead of answering, Evangeline moved to the window facing west. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of the stained glass windows below. In the distance, she could see the jagged outline of mountains, dark against the brilliant sky. My father wasn't just a lawyer, she said quietly. He was also a drunk and a gambler. By the time he died, he owed money to half of Boston. I spent 2 years learning to forge his signature, to manipulate bank records, to make debt collectors believe payments had been made when they hadn't. Jake stared at her. You're saying you know how to. I'm saying I know how to disappear. And I know how to take someone with me. She turned back to him. But I need to know something first. What? Are you guilty? Not of the bank robbery. I already know you did that. But are you the kind of man who would hurt innocent people to get what he wants? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunshot. Jake could lie, could tell her what she wanted to hear. But something in her eyes demanded honesty. I robbed 3 banks, he said finally. Never killed anyone who wasn't shooting at me first. Never took more than I needed to survive. But I did take money that didn't belong to me, and I did it with a gun in my hand. He paused. That make me guilty enough for you. Evangeline was quiet for a long moment. Below them, she could hear Garrett's men spreading out, taking positions around the church. Tom was running out. My mother died of consumption when I was 23, she said. Slow, painful, nothing the doctors could do. But there was medicine, expensive, medicine from Europe that might have helped. We couldn't afford it because my father had gambled away everything we had. Jake waited, sensing there was more. I used to lie awake at night, thinking about what I would do if I could go back. If I could steal enough money to buy that medicine, would I? If I could rob a bank to save her life, would I? Evangeline's voice grew stronger. The answer was, always yes. So who am I to judge you for doing what you had to do? Jacob, Garrett's voice boomed from the street. Time's up. Jake heard the sound of boots on the church steps, the creak of the heavy wooden doors opening below. In minutes, they'd be surrounded. The rope, he said urgently. Use the rope. But Evangeline was already moving, not toward the corner where the rope waited, but toward the bell itself. She grabbed the thick rope that hung from the bronze bell, testing its weight. What are you doing? Buying us time. She pulled hard on the rope, and the bell's deep tone rang out across the valley. Once, twice, 3 times, the traditional signal for fire or emergency. The effect was immediate. Doors opened throughout the town as people rushed out to see what was wrong. Garrett's men found themselves surrounded by confused townsfolk, their attention divided between the church and the growing crowd. Now, Evangeline said, moving to the western window. While they're distracted, Jake followed her gaze and saw what she'd seen, a narrow ledge that ran along the back of the church, leading to the roof of the adjoining building. From there, they could reach the livery stable without being seen. You're crazy, he said, but he was already checking his gun, preparing to move. Maybe. Evangeline swung one leg over the windowsill. But I'd rather be crazy and alive than sensible and dead. As they prepared to climb out into the growing darkness, Jake caught her arm. Why? He asked. Why are you doing this? Evangeline looked back at him, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes bright with determination and something else, something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. Because I've spent my whole life playing it safe, she said. And look where it got me. Alone, broke, and running from my past just like you. Maybe it's time I tried something different. They climbed out onto the ledge as the first of Garrett's men reached the bell tower. Below them, the crowd was growing larger, more confused, more angry at being pulled from their suppers by what appeared to be a false alarm. But as they inched along the narrow ledge toward an uncertain future, Evangeline realized that everything she thought she knew about herself was about to change, and the man beside her might be the key to discovering who she really was. The ledge was narrower than it had looked from inside the bell tower. Evangeline pressed her back against the rough stone walls of the church, her fingers clawing for purchase as she inched toward the adjacent building. Below, the confused crowd milled about in the street, their voices rising in speculation about the false alarm. Above, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Don't look down, Jake whispered behind her, his own voice tight with concentration. Too late for that advice, she managed, her heart hammering as loose mortar crumbled under her feet and scattered into the alley below. They reached the roof of the general store just as shouts erupted from the church. Garrett's men had discovered the empty bell tower. Within minutes, the entire town would be crawling with searchers, Jake dropped silently onto the wooden shingles and reached up to help Evangeline down. For a moment, his hands spanned her waist, and she felt the warmth of his touch through the fabric of her dress. Their eyes met in the starlight, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement that they were no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance, but partners bound by choice. "The livery stable," he said quietly, releasing her. They moved across the rooftops like shadows, jumping the narrow gaps between buildings with the desperation of the hunted. Behind them, torches began to flicker to life as the search spread through the town. Evangeline's practical wool dress caught on every splinter and nail, but she pushed forward, driven by an energy she'd never felt before. The stable sat at the edge of town, its large doors opening onto the desert beyond. They dropped from the roof of the barber shop onto the hay-strewn ground, landing with soft thuds that seemed impossibly loud in the night air. "Stay here," Jake whispered, drawing his gun. "I'll get the horses." But as he moved toward the stalls, a lantern flared to life in the darkness. "I was wondering when you'd show up." The voice belonged to old Pete, the stable master, a grizzled man with kind eyes and hands gnarled from decades of working with horses. "Heard tell there was some excitement in town tonight." Jake's gun was trained on the old man, but Pete seemed unconcerned. He set the lantern on a post and began moving toward the stalls with practiced efficiency. "You planning to shoot me, son?" Pete asked conversationally. "Because if you are, you might want to hurry. Marshal Garrett's got men watching every road." "Out of town? Then why are you helping us?" Evangeline stepped out of the shadows, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Pete glanced at her with something like approval. "Because I knew Wade Garrett when he was just another deputy with more ambition than sense. And I knew this boy when he was riding with honest men, trying to make an honest living." He led a sleek mare from her stall. "Sometimes a man's got to choose between what's legal and what's right." Within minutes, Pete had saddled 2 horses, the mare for Evangeline and a sturdy gelding for Jake. He pressed saddlebags filled with supplies into their hands, along with a canteen of water and a rifle for Evangeline. "You know how to use this?" Pete asked, indicating the rifle. "My father taught me." Another lie that revealed a truth. Her father had been many things, but he'd also been a man who understood that the frontier demanded certain skills of everyone, regardless of gender. "Good. You're going to need it." Pete moved to the stable doors, peering out into the night. "There's a trail about 2 miles south of here, follows the old mining road up into the mountains. Stays hidden in the canyon walls most of the way. If you can reach it without being seen." "Why are you doing this?" Jake asked, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite hide. Pete turned back to them, his weathered face serious. "Because 20 years ago, I was the one running from Wade Garrett. He was just a deputy then, but he was already dirty, already taking money from the wrong people." The old man's eyes grew distant. "I was innocent of what they accused me of, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that I had information Garrett needed buried." "What happened?" Evangeline found herself asking. "I ran, changed my name, started over. But I never forgot what it felt like to have nowhere to turn, no one to trust." Pete handed Jake a small leather pouch. "Gold pieces. Not much, but enough to get you started somewhere new." Jake stared at the pouch as if it contained something more valuable than money. "I can't." "You can and you will. Because that woman beside you is risking everything to help you, and you're going to need every advantage you can get." The sound of approaching horses cut through the night air. Garrett's search was expanding, moving toward the outskirts of town. "Go," Pete said urgently. "Due south for 2 miles, then west into the canyon. There's a hidden spring about halfway up. You'll know it by the cottonwood trees. Rest there until dawn, then keep moving." Jake swung up onto his horse, then looked down at the old man. "Pete, get out of here, son, and take care of that lady. She's got more sand than most men I've known." They rode hard through the sagebrush, their horses' hooves muffled by the sandy soil. Behind them, the lights of Copper Creek grew smaller. But the sound of pursuit never seemed to fade entirely. Every shadow could hide a rider. Every sound might be the click of a rifle being cocked point 2 miles south of town. They found the trail Pete had described, barely more than a deer path winding between towering rock walls. The canyon swallowed them, its darkness so complete that they had to trust their horses to find the way. "How do you know Pete was telling the truth?" Evangeline asked as they navigated a particularly narrow section of the trail. I don't, Jake admitted. But right now, he's the only person who's offered to help us without asking for anything in return. They rode in silence for a while. The only sounds the soft footfalls of their horses and the whisper of wind through the canyon walls. Evangeline found herself thinking about the choices that had led her here, not just the events of the past few hours, but the years of careful living that had brought her to this moment of wild abandon. What will you do? She asked eventually. If we make it to Mexico, I mean. Jake was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I used to think I'd start over. New name, new life, maybe. Find some honest work on a ranch somewhere. He paused. But that was before. Before what? Before I realized I might not be running alone. The words hung in the night air between them, heavy with implication. Evangeline felt something flutter. In her chest. Not fear, but anticipation. The idea of starting over, of building something new with this man who'd shown her a different version of herself, was both terrifying and exhilarating. They found the spring just as Pete had described, a small oasis of green in the harsh landscape. Cottonwood trees provided shelter from the wind, and clear water bubbled up from the rocks. They dismounted and led their horses to drink, the animals grateful for the rest. We should keep moving, Jake said, but he made no move to mount up again. The horses need rest, Evangeline replied. And so do we. She was right, and they both knew it. They'd been running on fear and adrenaline for hours, and exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. Jake unsaddled the horses while Evangeline explored their temporary sanctuary, marveling at how life could flourish even in the most unlikely places. It's beautiful, she said, running her fingers along the smooth bark of a cottonwood. Peaceful. For now. Jake's voice carried a note of warning. But Garrett won't give up. He can't afford to let me live, not with what I know about him. Then we'll have to make sure he never finds us. Jake looked at her across the small clearing. This woman who'd turned his world upside down in the space of a few hours. In the moonlight, she looked like something from a dream. Hair loose around her shoulders, eyes bright with determination, chin lifted in defiance of everything that threatened them. You could still go back, he said quietly. Tell them I forced you to come, that you escaped when I wasn't watching. They'd believe you. Would you? She asked. Believe me, I mean. The question caught him off guard. Does it matter? It matters. To me. Jake moved closer, drawn by something in her voice. No, he said honestly. I wouldn't believe you. Because I've seen who you really are, and she's not someone who gives up when things get difficult. Then you have your answer. Evangeline stepped closer as well, until they were standing arm's length apart. I'm not going back, Jake. Not to that life. Not to who I was before. Whatever happens next, we face it together. The space between them seemed to crackle with electricity. Jake reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek, and she leaned into the touch. For a moment, the danger pursuing them faded into the background, replaced by something warmer and more immediate. Evangeline, he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. She rose up on her toes, her hands finding his shoulders, and their lips met in a kiss that tasted of desperation and hope in equal measure. It was gentle at first, then fierce, as if they were trying to pour all their unspoken promises into that single moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. We should, Jake began. I know, she said, but neither of them moved away. It was the sound of a rifle being cocked that brought them back to reality. Well, drawled a familiar voice from the shadows. Ain't this touching? Deputy Marshal. Crenshaw stepped into the moonlight, his weapon trained on Jake's chest. Behind him, 3 more men emerged from the rocks, all armed, all smiling with the satisfaction of a successful hunt. Wade figured you'd head for the canyons, Crenshaw continued. Sent us ahead while he covered the main roads. Got to say, though, we didn't expect to find you playing house with the schoolmarm. Jake's hand moved toward his gun, but Crenshaw shook his head. I wouldn't if I were you. See, Wade wants you alive for the hanging. But he didn't say nothing about the woman. The click of 4 hammers being pulled back echoed through the canyon like the sound of fate itself, and Evangeline realized that their desperate gamble for freedom had just become a fight for their very lives. Time slowed to the space between. Heartbeats. Jake's mind calculated distances, angles, possibilities. For men, all with rifles trained on them. The nearest cover was 10 feet away, too far to reach before bullets found their mark. But Evangeline was still standing close enough to touch, close enough to shield with his body if it came to that. Easy. Now, Crenshaw said, reading Jake's thoughts. Let's keep this civilized. Drop your gun belt, nice and slow. Jake's fingers moved to his buckle, but his eyes never left Crenshaw's face. Garrett's not here to see this through himself. Wade's got bigger fish to fry. Seems the territorial governor's been asking questions about missing bank money and dead witnesses. Crenshaw's smile was cold. Amazing how problems have a way of solving themselves when the right people disappear. You mean when the right people get murdered? Evangeline said, her voice steady despite the guns pointed at her. Hart, lady, you've got a mouth on you. Might want to learn when to keep it shut. One of Crenshaw's men, a scarred brute with tobacco-stained teeth, stepped closer. Course, where you're going, talking won't be much of a concern. That's when Evangeline noticed something the men had missed in their eagerness to corner there. Prey. The cottonwood trees around the spring weren't just providing cover. They were old, their massive trunks scarred by decades of flash floods that had carved this oasis from solid rock. And flash floods meant water had somewhere to go. She caught Jake's eye and glanced meaningfully toward the rocks behind them. His brow furrowed for a moment. Then understanding dawned. There had to be a passage back there, carved by countless seasons of rushing water. You're right, she said to Crenshaw, her voice carrying farther than necessary. We should have stayed in town. Should have trusted the law to sort things out fairly. Jake picked up her cue immediately. Yeah, well, too late for regrets now. He raised his voice as well, his words echoing off the canyon walls. Guess we're about to find out what passes for justice these days. The echoes were what they'd been hoping for, a subtle confirmation that the rocks behind them were hollow, that there was space beyond the visible walls of their small sanctuary. Touching, real touching, Crenshaw drawled. Now drop them weapons and… The scream of a mountain lion cut through the night like a blade. Every man froze, heads turning toward the sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In the desert, nothing was more feared than a cornered cat, and this one sounded close. Too close. In that moment of distraction, Jake moved. He dove left, rolling behind the nearest cottonwood as his Colt cleared leather in one fluid motion. His first shot took down Crenshaw's scarred companion before the man could swing his rifle around. His second shattered the deputy's gun arm, sending the weapon spinning into the darkness. Evangeline didn't hesitate. She grabbed the rifle Pete had given her and fired into the rocks above their heads, sending a shower of stone fragments down on the remaining gunmen. In the confusion, she darted toward the back wall of the oasis, feeling for the opening she'd suspected was there. Her fingers found empty air. Jake, she called. This way. More shots echoed through the canyon as Jake fought a running battle with the surviving bounty hunters. One of them had taken cover behind the spring itself, using the rocks as protection while he tried to get a clear shot. Son of a bitch won't die easy, the man muttered, levering another round into his rifle. That's when the mountain lion screamed again, closer this time, and they all realized it hadn't been a cat at all. Old Pete emerged from the rocks above them. Like a phantom, his own rifle speaking with deadly accuracy. The bounty hunter by the spring pitched forward into the water, his blood darkening the moonlit pool. Told you boys to leave well enough alone. Pete called down, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd spent decades surviving in places that killed the weak and unwary. Crenshaw was clutching his wounded arm, his face twisted with pain and rage. This ain't over, Rourke. Wade's got connections all the way to Washington. He'll hunt you to the ends of the earth. Maybe, Jake said, stepping out from behind the tree with his gun trained on the deputy. But he'll have to find us first. The passage Evangeline had discovered led deeper into the canyon system, following an underground stream that eventually emerged miles away on the other side of the mountain. Pete knew the route, had used it himself 20 years ago when Wade Garrett's corruption had first forced him to run. They traveled through the night, their horses picking their way carefully along the narrow ledges and hidden paths that only someone with intimate knowledge of the land could navigate. By dawn, they had emerged into a valley Jake had never seen before, green with grass and dotted with wildflowers that seemed impossible in this harsh landscape. There's a town about 50 miles south of here, Pete said as they paused to rest. The horses, place called Esperanza. Got friends there who don't ask too many questions about where folks come from. Why? Jake asked, the same question he'd posed in the stable. Why risk everything to help us? Pete was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands gentle on his horse's neck. I told you about running from Garrett 20 years ago. What I didn't tell you was that I had a daughter then. Sweet little thing, maybe 8 years old. His voice grew soft. Garrett used her to get to me, threatened to hurt her if I didn't keep quiet about what I knew. Evangeline felt something cold settle in her stomach. What happened to her? Had to send her away. Far away, to people who could keep her safe. Never saw her again. Pete's eyes were distant, lost in memories. But I heard things over the years. Heard she grew up strong and smart and brave. Heard she became a teacher back east. The words hit Evangeline like a physical blow. What was her name? She whispered. Evangeline, Pete said simply. Named her after her mother. The truth crashed over her in waves. The father she'd thought was a weak man, a gambler and a drunk. He'd been Pete Hartwell, a man forced to abandon everything to protect his child from Wade Garrett's reach. The drinking, the gambling, the gradual destruction of their family fortune. It had all been an elaborate charade to convince Garrett that Pete was no longer a threat. Papa. The word escaped her lips as a sob. Pete's weathered face crumpled, with 20 years of suppressed emotion. Hello, little bird. Jake watched father and daughter reunite with something that felt like awe. In the space of a few hours, he'd witnessed more courage and love than he'd seen in years of running alone. As Evangeline threw herself into her father's arms, Jake understood something fundamental about the woman who'd changed his life. She hadn't learned to be brave in a single night. She'd been raised by it. 3 months later, in the small town of Esperanza, Jake Rourke married Evangeline Hartwell in a ceremony officiated by a retired judge who asked no questions about their past. Pete walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes, finally able to openly claim the child he'd sacrificed everything to protect. They started a small ranch on the outskirts of town, raising horses and teaching the local children to read and write. Jake never touched another bank, and Evangeline never looked back toward the life she'd left behind in Boston. They built something real together, something that grew stronger with each passing season. Wade Garrett never found them. Some said he'd been arrested by federal marshals for corruption and murder. Others claimed he'd simply disappeared into the same desert that had swallowed so many men before him. Jake preferred not to think about it either way. The past was the past, and the future was what they made of it. On quiet evenings, when the desert wind carried the scent of blooming cactus flowers through their windows, Jake would sometimes remember the moment he'd first seen Evangeline through the schoolhouse window. He'd been a desperate man running from his past, and she'd been a woman looking for her future. Neither of them could have imagined that they'd find what they were searching for in each other. The roses Evangeline planted by their front door thrived. In the desert soil, their blooms a daily reminder that the most beautiful things could flourish even in the harshest places, if they had the right care, the right partnership, the right love to help them grow. And in the evenings, when the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they would sit on their porch and watch the desert bloom around them, knowing that sometimes the most dangerous journey a person could take was the one that led them home. Well now, partner, if that tale of love and redemption stirred something in your heart, don't forget to give it a like and share your thoughts below. And if you're hungry for more stories of romance on the frontier, make sure to subscribe. There's always another adventure waiting just over the next ridge.